जो भी गांव में महिलाएं फ्री में घर में बैठी थी, जिनके पास कुछ काम नहीं था, उन गरीब महिलाओं को काम मिले और अपनी आर्थिक स्थिति को मजबूत कर सकें।
Good morning and a very warm welcome to day 2 of the Livelihoods India Summit hosted by Axis and co-hosted by Niti Aayog. I hope you enjoyed the first day themes and deliberations across plenary sessions, thematic tracks, as also the fireside chat sessions. Thank you for joining us this morning for the plenary session, Empowering Women in Rural India, What Have We Learned? Curated by 3IE. It's my pleasure to introduce this well-represented panel. I welcome our speakers for the session, Dr. Anjani Kochar, 3IE Senior Fellow. We also have with us Sejal Dand, Executive Director at Anandi. Also joining us is Garima Sivach, Economic Researcher at the American Institutes for Research. I welcome the moderator for the session, Sachi Bhalla, Program Officer at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. With this, I hand over to Sachi to take forward this conversation. It's over to you, Sachi.
Thank you, Pooja, and good morning to all participants and to the speakers. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator for this session, which is really focused on looking at what does women's empowerment mean in rural India? What have we learned? And maybe reflecting on it from the perspective of how does one look at evidence generation, expanding the field of research and evidence, and also bringing in a practitioner's perspective. I'll just spend a few minutes to introduce the panel. Dr. Anjani Kochar is a 3IE Senior Research Fellow and Senior Research Fellow at the Global Center for Gender Equality at Stanford University. She has served as the Director of the India Program at the Stanford Center on Global Poverty and Development from 2000 to 2019. And prior to this, she was an Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University. Dr. Kochar has received her PhD in Economics from the University of Chicago and holds a Master's in International Relations also from the University of Chicago. She has been a past recipient of Sloan Foundation Fellowship, a McNamara Faculty Fellowship, and was a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution in 2000-2001. Her research is really focused on microeconomics of development and specifically on issues related to education, health, credit, population, inequality, and of course on gender. Her research has been published in leading journals, including the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy. We also have today Garima Sivach. Garima is an economic researcher at AIR, where she works on impact evaluations and cost effectiveness analysis, and focuses really on employment programs, education, and women's economic empowerment in particular. She's also a member of the Evidence Consortium on Women's Groups, where she's leading the design of costing and cost effectiveness guidelines for women's groups programs and conducting research on state-specific implementation, costs and returns on investments of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, NRLM. Prior to returning to graduate school, Dr. Sivach worked as the Director of Rural Initiatives with a microfinance institution in India, and she designed and piloted livelihoods interventions for rural women and landless households. We also have Sejal Dand. Sejal is a feminist activist engaged with organizing rural and indigenous women in India for the past 25 years with Anandi. She is currently the Executive Director of Anandi and also a member of the CSAG at the UN Women Office for India, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. She has served as and continues to serve as the gender technical resource person to several state government programs and organizations in India. Sejal has been engaged with the national steering groups of a number of organizations, including the Right to Food and Women Farmers Alliances like Makam, gender mainstreaming in finance, rural livelihoods, and sustainable agricultural programs in states and with civil society organizations. She has led a number of action research studies and is a published author specifically on engendering rural livelihoods, women's human rights, social protection, and food policies. With that, I would like to invite Anjani to share findings from an evaluation that she has been leading, specifically focused on empowerment through programs such as the National Rural Livelihood Mission. Anjani, if you could share your screen, and great, thanks.
Just taking a minute to get it set up. Okay, is that fine? Everybody can see the screen?
Yes.
Start by just thanking both Pooja and Sachi, and then the organizers of this conference, Access and Niti Aayog, for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm delighted, really happy to be here. The research I'm going to be discussing today is part of, as Sachi mentioned, it's part of an ongoing evaluation of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. And I'll be focusing in particular on two thematic papers on women's empowerment that we've recently written. This research is being conducted by a team of researchers from 3IE and from Riti Livelihood Partners. And I wanted to acknowledge the work of their team in the research you're going to see today. We've also received a lot of support from the Ministry of Rural Development, from Gates Foundation, and from the World Bank. And I wanted to thank these institutions and acknowledge their support. Of course, the usual disclaimer applies in that all that I'm going to be saying today reflects the views of the authors and not the views of the institutions. So if we start any discussion on women's empowerment in India, we have to note the tremendous strides that have been taken since in the past 10 years, 15 years. This is data from the Economic Survey of 2017-18, and they have a tremendous chapter on women's empowerment that I encourage everyone to read. They developed an indicator of based on 17 indicators of women's status from the National Family Health Survey. And that indicator shows the improvement that women have made between the years 2005-6 and 2015-16, improvement in every state in India. The chapter also notes the areas in which there has been no progress and sometimes even a reversal of progress. And the two areas that stand out are women's labor force participation rates and issues relating to son preference. So this is also from that same chapter, and it places India globally, compares the position in 1970 to the position in 2014. So in 1970, India was doing worse than it should have given its level of income. This is the ratio, number of boys relative to girls. And you can see how much things worsened between 2014 and 1970. India now is a real outlier given its level of per capita income. So with that as background, if we start the discussion, it's perhaps useful to start with considering what the common definition is of women's empowerment. It's commonly defined as a transformation of power relations that happens when women exercise agency. And it depends, at least the common view is that it depends on assets, on entitlements and rights, and on institutional structures. So when you talk of the transformation of power relations, we can talk about power relations in many different spheres. Women's power relative to local Gram Panchayat leaders or relative to teachers and health workers. So I'm going to be narrow in this talk and focus only on power relationships within the household. This is the intra-household distribution of power between husbands and wives. So if I take the definition in the previous slide and adapt it to this particular context, the way we think of it is that men and women differ in their preferences over a set of goods. Women have a certain set of preferences. These not only include preferences for saris, but also the assumption is that women have a preference for more investments in their children's schooling. They have a preference for reduced fertility relative to husbands, and they have a preference for greater equality in investments on sons relative to boys. So given this difference in preferences, how are allocations decided? Well, the allocation of income within the household will reflect women's bargaining power relative to her husbands. And the widespread assumption in the literature is that this in turn is a reflection of the three things that were noted in the previous slide: women's assets, their individual assets, rights and entitlements, and institutions. And this has led to a large set of policies which says that if we want to empower women, then we have to ensure that women have assets of their own. So in this talk, with that background, I'm going to address the following issues. I'm going to focus on financial assets, drawing, of course, on our evaluation of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission and self-help groups. And the question I'm going to ask is, does access to loans and savings help empower women? The second topic I'll address is the link between financial assets and livelihoods, given that, of course, that is the focus of this conference. And the third is the persistence in son preference, that I showed you in the first few slides. Access to loans and savings, empower women. So just got a message saying my internet is unstable, so I hope there are no problems with this. Okay, so drawing on our evaluation of the NRLP, what we found was that the overall impact of the program on decision making is insignificant. This reflects what goes on in initial stages of self-help groups. The initial work is based on internal savings, and loans come out of internal savings. So those loan amounts are very small. And these small amounts of loans have little impact on women. But the benefits from SAGs increase over time through large cash infusions. After 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, SAGs are able to get community investment funds, the CIFs, and they also benefit from SAG bank linkages. So in the paper, we examined what happened with CIFs. And the graph on the right shows you exactly what happens. 0 is the year in which the SAG got to CIF. Prior, loan amounts are very small. And if you distinguish between those states which give large CIF amounts and small CIF amounts, those are the red and blue lines, there's no difference in loan amounts. But following of CIFs, the loans that SAGs give to their members increases dramatically in states which have large CIF amounts. It triples compared to the states with low CIF amounts. And if you look at the impact of this huge increase in CIFs, it has a significant impact on women's empowerment. So the first takeaway from this talk is that enhancing access to loans does empower women, but only if those loans are large, not from the regular internal lending and savings that goes on. So put differently, if SAGs are restricted just to internal borrowing and saving, there would be no reason to target financial access to women. We would have got the same result from any general program of financial inclusion, such as all the programs that started in 2011 and went on through Jan-Dhan. So the corollary to this first takeaway is that unless loans are large, any benefits that we see of SAGs are not a consequence of women's improved access to financial markets, but a consequence of other features of SAGs. And I think some of the other members of this panel will speak to these other features of SAGs that may have good outcomes. This does not mean that we stop targeting financial services at women. So I want to be clear on that. So this is not saying that we should just give up on SAGs. It says that instead we have to ensure the effectiveness of our programs. So another way of interpreting our results was that if you could ensure that states were giving CIFs of the amount of these high CIF states, and if you could ensure that CIFs were delivered on time, then we would have seen large improvements in women's decision-making. So the variation we used was actually this variation in implementation. And if it hadn't been there, if the same way, we would have seen those large effects. This particular graph is just showing you the variation in the amounts provided by different state governments. The program is operated in a decentralized way, so states can send their own norms, even though the central government makes recommendations about the norm. The central government makes a recommendation of about 1 lakh for each SAG, and that is what Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh provided. But then the amounts fall off quite considerably. So compared to the amount that Rajasthan is providing, Bihar provides about 30,000 rupees to the SAG. And the table on the left shows you what this means. So the first row is the amount provided by Rajasthan compared to Bihar. The second row shows you what was the average SAG loan prior to getting the CIF. So 2,500 rupees in Rajasthan compared to Bihar. It was higher in Rajasthan, but you can see how much that increases once you go to after the CIF. The CIF again has this huge difference in terms of the amounts that they can get. The second topic I wanted to address was assets and livelihoods. So go back again to what I talked about, the definition of women's empowerment and the focus on assets. This focus on assets, I think, misses the key learnings from the literature on poverty reduction, and in particular, the writings of Amartya Sen on endowments and entitlements. So if you go to Amartya Sen's writings, he emphasizes that we earn our income from our endowments. The endowments do, of course, include assets and rights and entitlements, and that is what has been emphasized in the literature on women's bargaining power. But it also includes these traditional endowments, labor, education, and labor market experience that accumulates over time. All these combine to provide the return to assets. So if someone gives me a loan, the return I get from the loan is very much a function of the work I put in, my education, and my past experience. And it is this return to the asset that determines my entitlements. So it's wrong, I think, to think of women's empowerment as coming from assets. Where it really comes from is the return that women get from their assets. This is the second takeaway or major point of this presentation. The return to assets for women, if they act independently, that is, if they set up their own enterprise without any input from their husbands, that return is very low. Okay. So here, women borrowing from an SAG, that gives them that particular asset. On the right, I just showed, this is what men's assets look like, but we'll disregard that difference for now and just talk about a common asset. So a loan of, say, 1 lakh or 50,000 rupees. That asset combines with the hours of work that men and women put in. I put in hours of work at ages 35 plus because that is the average age of a woman member of the SAG. It's actually about 38. Okay, so she combines the loan with her hours of work. Women's hours of work are much lower than men's hours of work. Why? Because hours of work reflect your time endowment. Time endowment determines your work experience in your early years of marriage, say between the years of 20 to 30 and 35. And both these, your current time endowment, your work experience, then result in your current hours of work. Okay, so compared to women who spend all their time in early marriage on childcare activities, domestic production, and then have a very patchy work experience after that. You probably can't make out this photograph. It's one of my favorite photographs from work I was doing in Kutch in the salt pans, which is where migrant labor go. And the picture is of a woman who is feeding her child while she works. So her work is interrupted every 3 or 4 hours to feed her child, as a result of which she does not work the whole day. Her pay is less, and translating on to women in other fields, your accumulated work experience is low. If we compare that to men who have far less chores in the household, and so far more time to devote to themselves, to accumulate work experience, to work full-time as a consequence, and build up a strong work history. And that's what shows up in this difference between women's hours of work and men's hours of work. The implication is that if you give the same amount of loan, the same exact asset to a woman and to a man, you're going to get differential returns from the same asset, the return that men get being much more than the return that women get. Given that, an immediate corollary is that the household is better off if women use their assets to support their husband's business and not their own business. So the large loans that we give to women are really large loans to men. It's a myth that SAG loans are not collateralized. When you speak to an SAG member or the whole group of SAG members and ask, why did this woman get a loan for 1 lakh, whereas everybody else got a loan for 5,000? They'll tell you very clearly that loans are made on the basis of the woman's ability to repay. They only go to a few women, and ability to repay is judged primarily on husband's income earning capacity. So I was doing field work just before COVID, February 2020, and the year prior to that. So this is for field work in Orissa and Jharkhand. So I'm just giving you one example, but every SAG has the same sort of pattern. So in this particular case, one woman received 2.5 lakhs in loans in 4 separate installments. There was not a single other woman in the SAG who received anything more than 10,000. Why did she get this? Her husband runs a business, and so everybody knew that she would be able to repay the business. That loan went into her husband's business and had the function of making it. So what are the implications of this for women's bargaining power? The first is, of course, it is determined. You could say that, okay, she got a loan, husband got a huge increase in his income, and so the household is much better off. Doesn't that mean that the woman's bargaining power has also increased and she is also much better off? That's not true, because the rate of the woman's bargaining power is determined by the rate of return she would earn if she used the loan herself without involving her husband. And that's that differential rate of return. So that low rate of return implies that women's bargaining power improves only marginally. Men may gain much, much more. And we would observe from this loan that is supposedly given to empower women, we would observe growing disparity in the hours of work of men and women. So that obviously leaves this question, how best can we empower women? And what I have been suggesting is that we have to increase the rate of return to assets, and that rate of return, that differential, comes from differences in hours of work. So we have to increase women's hours of work. And that, of course, goes back to determinants, time endowments, work experience of history. This is a different push than you hear commonly. What you hear commonly is on the supply side, that women's hours of work are low because of the lack of availability of suitable jobs or lack of local employment. And I don't want to take away from all those explanations because those are certainly very, very valid. I just want to emphasize the importance of the experiences in early marriage and how women's care responsibilities in early marriage actually set the trajectory of her life cycle income. So this graph here shows men's hours of work in all income earning activities, whether it's wage labor or own farm enterprise or any own non-agricultural enterprise. This is women's hours of work also for the same income earning activities. And this is women's time spent in domestic work. And you can see that in these early years, 20 to 30, the huge amount of time that women have to spend in domestic work, which translates immediately into very limited workforce participation and work experience in early marriage years. That sets the trajectory of hours of work of the life cycle. And you can see the difference between men's trajectory and women's. Men's peaks at around 30 years or 35 years of age, which is when wages peak for men as well. And so it follows wages, and men's hours of work are largely responsive to wages. Women's hours of work peaks at about 45 or so, which is way past their prime earning years. So in their prime earning years, women are not working as much as they would be working because of these childcare responsibilities. What would we like to see? The ideal situation would be if at this time when you enter marriage, your early adult life, you can choose the trajectory of your life. That trajectory will obviously involve choices about children. Some women may choose to have few children, some women may choose to have more children, some women may choose to stay at home, other women may choose to work, but that is a choice you make. What happens instead is that women start childbearing at an early age, and childbearing then determines the trajectory of their life. So again, I want to emphasize these early experiences and how much they affect what happens to women going forward. You'll see in this paper, I use data a lot. In our reports that you'll see on the web pages, there's a lot of econometric analysis. What I'm emphasizing over here is the importance of women's hours of work, or women's empowerment has to be about hours of work. But all that empirical analysis is actually just what women are telling us over and over again. So this is from these gender transformative training workshops. MORD is piloting a set of gender transformative initiatives in self-help groups. The work is tremendous work, supported by Gates and other foundations, and implemented by some of India's leading NGOs, which includes Anandi, and so I'm sure you're going to hear more about it. So this was from some training sessions that I participated in, and the training sessions themselves are tremendous. They go on for 3 days, 5 days, even longer. In this particular one, women break into groups, and each day is devoted to a different topic. They gather all the experiences in the storyboard, they talk about it to each other, and they really open up about what's going on in their lives, why they are where they are, and what they're unhappy about. And the topic that always is the most emotional is when you start talking about husbands and wives and the different roles and responsibilities of husbands and wives and what this means. And almost invariably, I think women start crying, and if you're a participant, when I'm participating, I start crying too, because the stories are so moving. These are all quotes from this particular session, and I'll just read them out in case you can't see them. A woman can do every household chore, but if she has no earnings, she gets no respect. All respect comes from earning income. When a man earns, he is the leader of the family. He dictates everything, and the woman has to obey. Only when women become financially independent will male dominance reduce. So that sort of a bleak picture that unless we are able to increase women's hours of work, as they say, only when women become financially independent, are we going to see an improvement in them. So is that really the case? Do women have any other choice or any other alternative? They actually do. And that alternative is to invest in their sons rather than their husbands. And so the finding from our second paper was that as women do become more empowered, as women's income increases, rather than there being a reduction in gender inequalities between sons and daughters, we see those inequalities being exacerbated. Son preference increases. And the reason for this, I think, is simple. When you're talking about husbands and wives and bargaining position, that bargaining position reflects the returns to women's assets, as I've been emphasizing, but it also reflects social norms. And the social norms in relationships between husbands and wives are very much in favor of husbands. But the social norms in relationships between a mother and a son are very much in favor of a mother. A son's responsibility is to his mother, much more so than at least the way norms are implemented in much of rural India, much more so than his responsibility to his wife. As a result of which, and I think women recognizing this, at any opportunity, they will invest in their sons. This is a quote from a woman I was interviewing. What do you want in life? What would make your life better? She's 45 years old, but she replied, it is too late for any changes in my life, but I would like to see my son's income increase. So the fourth takeaway from this talk is there's an additional cost of failure if we fail to enhance women's earning capabilities. And that cost is persistent son preference. So to conclude, 4 main points that I emphasized in this and that I'd like to leave you with. The first is that enhancing access to loans empowers women, but only if the loans are large enough. The second is that women's bargaining power reflects the return that they get from financial assets, not from their ownership of assets, but the return from assets. And in the current scenario, this is low. So men get a much higher return from loans to women, and we are actually increasing inequalities in hours of work under the current scenario. The third takeaway is the huge toll of childcare on women's early work experiences and the importance of early work experiences for setting the trajectory of her life. And the fourth is the one on son preference, this additional cost of failure to enhance women's earning capabilities. What does this mean? It means that we invest in women, we do a lot to empower them. Women in turn will perpetuate inequalities between sons and daughters. And so then again, in the next generation, we have to start over because those inequalities still exist. So unless we're able to address this, we end up with just in a classic poverty trap. Those are my 4 points, and I'll turn it over to the other members of the panel.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for taking us through a really sort of hard-hitting presentation, great sort of weaving together of the stories, the examples from real life, and really what does that mean in terms of sort of takeaways. I thought before I turn over to the other panelists, I would just sort of share a few reflections on how we at the Gates Foundation have built up our work around women's economic empowerment, and really sort of, keeping women's agency at the center, and thinking about empowerment really being about voice, choice, and agency. And I think you touch upon each of those factors in a sense as you went through your presentation and shared, the findings of the evaluation. We also sort of really believe that what gets measured is what matters. That's what gets done. And so from that perspective, I thought it would be really helpful to hear from Garima at this point, maybe to just sort of touch upon how the field of evaluation is evolving, what is really required. Maybe also sort of thinking a little bit about, as we think about women's empowerment programs, where does sort of participation and participatory approaches kind of fit in? And possibly also if you could comment on how does one even measure empowerment, and what would be your sort of advice into as we move forward in looking at programs like NRLM? What should be sort of prioritized as we look at an evaluation, but really to make a program better? So with that, over to you, Garima.
Yeah, thanks, Sachi, and thank you, Anjani. First, I want to just congratulate you, Anjani, and the team for doing this massive amount of work on the NRLP evaluation. A lot of important lessons, I think, for us to see here. I think the first reflection that I probably have on the evaluation question is, we've seen a lot of evaluations of SDG programs in India. We've seen the DPIP evaluation in Andhra Telangana. We've seen past evaluations of the Jivika program in Bihar, and now, of course, this multi-state large-scale evaluation of the NRLP. I think what would be really important is to try to understand where things are working and where things are not working. And for that, we need a greater focus on process evaluations. So moving beyond studying impacts on these outcomes. If we were to, for example, synthesize findings across all of these different programs, how do we identify at what phase or what components of the program are working? And I think a lot of mixed methods research can actually speak to that. So to give you an example, I think the Jivika program in Bihar, for example, there was an early evaluation done in 2010, 2012 by researchers from the World Bank, and they showed positive impacts on a number of indicators. And then when they did an evaluation again, I think 3IE did the evaluation again of a second phase of the Jivika program, they found that the impact had actually diminished. And looking at the implementation research, they found that the implementation quality and the way the CRPs, the facilitators were recruited, were trained, was very different between the two phases. So I think we need to really focus on using some more mixed methods research on understanding the processes to identify what is working and what is not working. So that is one. My second point would be that maybe especially for collective action, participation in programs, these programs were built as supporting institutions of the poor, as supporting community institutions. But to what extent do women actually have a voice? To what extent are women actually participating in these institutions? I think that is something, and maybe again, tying back to the first point on using more mixed methods research to try to identify that, are women actually being active participants in these programs? And to what extent can a government program, especially one that is operated at such a large scale, to what extent can this program actually integrate women's participation in building those institutions? And my third point will be for empowerment measurement. I think Anjani, like your slide indicated that childcare and health security, these are actually tied to the return on assets for women, but we often don't see these factors being taken into account when we are measuring empowerment. We see these factors as enablers or barriers upfront, but can we now start looking at economic empowerment as a holistic measure, which is also including things like access to childcare or health security of women? Just to completely agree with your point on return to assets being lower for women because of these additional burdens, so to say. So that would be all from my side, Sachi.
Thanks, Garima. And maybe with that, we just turn over to Sejal. Sejal, you've been working with NRLM for decades, and at the state level, at the national level, with civil society. So you really have a sense of, how do government programs get designed? How do they get implemented? What's the partnership between government and civil society, working with women's groups directly, of course, but also a perspective around how does one really learn from how programs are implemented. So it would be really great to hear from you, your experience and reflections on what has one learned from the field, and how does one sort of then go back and inform the implementation of policies.
Thank you. I thought, Anjani, it was really sharp and very useful. I find that just investments in investigating women's empowerment on scale, when we are all trying to build evidence, is lacking, and every bit of research is useful. And your takeaways and being able to connect this to what are we seeing shift and not shift are really useful. With that, I am going to actually draw upon some of, before I answer the question that you posed to me, let me look at some of what I think the evidence that Anjani pointed to me yesterday, and I was looking at it. So because there are lots of friends from the livelihood sector here, I think what has NRLM been able to do? The evidence from their study shows that we've been able to reach the poorest women in households. Now that's what not a majority of state programs have been able to do, and we've seen several. We've seen the Dwakras and the SGSYs, and probably the self-selecting program like NREGS does it better. But you have a significant proportion of STSC women who have reached. And so NRLM has cracked that barrier, reiterating what they've been saying, and they invested considerably in it. And I hope they're not diluting this as they are upscaling and reaching out to more members. The women that Anjani spoke of, I mean, I'm going to highlight again what that research report showed. The average age was 38, much older women. Average years of schooling was just 2.8 years. So there's a huge deficit of opportunities that these women have anyway come from. So they're starting with actually running through several obstacles which have preceded the time that they've come into the program itself. And 71% of those households, their major source of income was still from unskilled labor, wage labor. So just in terms of assets, I would assume that while we put ownership of assets as an indicator, I like to these days shift it as, do we have control over assets? And for most poor laboring households, that would be really control over your own labor and your body. And this idea of son preference is not only a woman's choice. When she gets married, who does she get married to? When does she have children? How many children should she have? These are questions that she has absolutely no decision making in this country over. because NFHS 3, 4, 5 show us that women have consistently shown preference for 2 children or less. And while fertility rates have probably stabilized across the country, except the Bimaru belt, these preferences come from a much larger systemic barrier. And Anjali's research also points to the context of the cyclical debt. And I find this very interesting, and many economists can't reconcile to this, that while each of his households, I think the figure was, Anjali, that their incomes were 75,000 on an average, and their debt on the household was 1,24,000. So an average debt of 70% households was close to 40,000 as reported in the study. And yet 64% reported some savings of 7,100, and in SHGs about 1,712. So this question is that while microfinance had no impact on increased incomes or assets, which is what many programs have shown, that the NRLM program, essential differences in the institutions of power they created, and that is what even the evidence points to, that they actually 40% SHGs and 49% of VOs reported convergence activities. And what is this convergence activity? It's really convergence around key programs on participation in Gram Sabhas, in the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, in Manrega. Those are the 3 critical programs. And what has not been reported or measured yet, which I find evidence on the ground, is really on social security, that we are seeing huge amounts of shifts that these women in SHGs are making in accessing entitlements, whether they be of the PDS, through the PDS, the food and civil supplies, or through health-seeking behavior in government programs, and ensuring that those also get regular and better quality health services are provided there, or through convergence on just seeking the large range of pensions. They might be very measly amounts, but because they're regular pensions, they're like very important, which is old age pension, widow pension, pension for handicapped. So you are seeing a lot of movement on these. And so for me, I mean, for the livelihood sector, this needs saying that if we have to envision that this extremely poor, marginalized communities are looking at their livelihood basket, they're not only looking at incomes, which might be, men's incomes from the left, or the women's incomes from the multitude of small activities that you would do across through the year. And therefore, you're never a worker because you're never into one activity for over 6 months a year. But also a very large part of the incomes come from the entitlements. Now, whether these be Manrega, which is straight a cash entitlement, or a pension, which is a cash entitlement, or it might be in the indirect form of, basic vaccines. They cost 22,000 on an average, what is provided free of cost through ICDS, or through a regular midday meal, or through the access to PDS grain, where you receive a subsidy of almost equal to 500 rupees, even under the minimal NFSA entitlement. And then on the other hand, what you're dealing with is the large outflows, and many of them are undesirable outflows. And they come from both community norms and lack of, like private healthcare expenditure in the Indian household is 70% is out-of-pocket expenses. So you can actually get an A&M to ensure, or a VHSND day to work, and you ensure that these basic primary healthcare services are available on time, then you can actually reduce 80% of that household expenditure. And this is where I think what NRLM did was provide a legitimacy. I think I agree with Anjani that we're very far away from actually women getting more opportunities for enterprise or markets or incomes directly. But what we are seeing is that women's mobility, this simple choice of where can I go, and can I go somewhere even within my own village, or speak to a group of women, or other places that I can go to without without household sanctions imposed on it. This breaking of the Lakshman Rekha is what NRLM has enabled. Large number of CRPs you are seeing go across from taluka to the block to the district, across the states as they're going for training. And these are huge opportunities, not so much on income where you're paid minimum wages, but just an exposure to be able to then look at the opportunities that exist outside of this. So I think this uh, freeing up of the mobilities are the questions that we need to ask, and then it has to go into the second level that Anjani explored on what is this level of negotiation that you're able to do with state and the office. I think negotiations within the whole home itself, redistribution of work within the home. I think the larger, she mentioned childcare, which is so true. The time you studies are showing it. The other big basket of actually for women, the time is on simple things like water, fetching water. I'm sure, Anjani, I don't know whether you asked that question, but it would be interesting to see how many households actually had one tap or access to piped drinking water or water in their household. And you'd probably find, given the states you explored, that less than 25% had that opportunity. So other infrastructure constraints that we talk about, which help to redistribute, which the state has responsibility for providing, NRLM and these platforms of women can actually bring their concerns, voice their concerns, and negotiate with the Gram Sabhas and at the block office to do that. So I think addressing women's labor, both unpaid and underpaid, if your major household income is from unskilled labor, to get fair and decent wages at work, to redistribute domestic work through better infrastructure, whether it be water, whether it be creches, these, or even firewood and fuel. In spite of Ujjwala, very few of these households actually have replenishment. So these are probably areas that we can do. I can very quickly go over what we are trying with NRLM, but I can stop here. What Swayam is trying and Anandi is trying, but I can stop here, take questions, and then go into this.
Sejal, thank you. I think you could go on for another 3-4 minutes.
Okay. So I think basically I agree with what some of the findings and recommendations are, that we need to invest much more into actually building the capacities of these collectives to become more stable, to become more equitable, to enable more opportunities for voice and better training skills. And I think this ability, moving from mobilization to actually organizing, the principles of organizing to be able to negotiate powers, both within the household and outside the household. If such a large percentage of populations of household, SC households are there. And we are seeing indications of this where I can talk of Saroj, who is, I was in, just last month, I was in Shevpur district with the Saharia block, where Saharia women are not allowed to wear slippers inside the village before the men. And Saroj was coming out and, they would carry slippers. And this questioning, why are women not allowed to wear chappal? Why is this a norm that we have adopted? And can we challenge it? It is a big deal. It's a big deal with dignity. And if the VO starts and the CLF starts actually questioning and creating a dialogue over it and strategizing on what can we do to enable this to happen, it's a big deal. Or in Nivas in Mandala, where another group of women were given a pond on lease, and the panchayats and the men, and they had to fight for 2 years to retain this idea that they will hold the pond and they will fish and they will take it to the market. It's a community resource, so there's not an individual ownership, but it is this commons and those resources there which can actually significantly shift the dialogue and actually break this very patriarchal norms of what women can do or what women cannot do, and what actually enable in this growing inequality in our country, the access of commons only to communities, not only to private corporates. So I think that's the other way that's the one that is giving us hope. I'm not able to move it. So I think this is what the Swayam project partners are trying to do. Anjani showed an example from Odisha. We are in 4 states, and Anandi works in MP, and we are all trying to see what is the opportunities we can do to strengthen and raise some of these questions, which we see have a direct impact on their livelihoods. If you take a broader view of livelihoods and over community resources and women's ability to use and access these. I think a shift that we need to see is really, are we in this hurry to upscale, of who are the CRPs and who's getting an opportunity, and can we deepen the opportunities for more number of women in the SHGs? And I find that it is really the single women who are breaking a lot of these gender patriarchal norms, and which are very deeply rooted in our culture. And so some of these criteria have been built into selecting the Samata Sakhis or the gender CRPs, and not only education. I'm not able to show you this. And lastly, the strategy needs to move from the Gram Panchayats to the block level. None of the NRLM institutions have a presence at the block level, and that's where most of the line departments, the police, the court, the health CHC facilities exist. And therefore, what is it that we can enable women in the block level to have a presence, to be informed, to negotiate for their rights and entitlements, to seek justice and accountability? And that's what this program is trying to do. And I think there are 2 examples I like to give when we talk of women's power, which are so invisible. They're known, but they're not talked about. The fact that Bihar imposed a ban on alcohol, I genuinely think it came from the energy of a lot of earlier movements, but at the time it happened because of the political will of the women group who agitated, formed by SHGs, collectives, and the Nitish Kumar leveraged that to be able to take this big decision, which actually reduced a lot of this unnecessarily household expenditure and violence against women. The other one is actually from 2 months back, where the CM of Madhya Pradesh is having a dialogue with SHG women, so that women have a political voice. They've become a larger number of voters in elections, is for me a sense of empowerment, and that these institutions of power give them visibility and a platform to engage on much larger political agenda. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sejal. Really giving a lot of flavor and real life sort of examples of like how NRLM and other programs run and look at empowerment, look at collective action. Anjani, I'm just wondering if you'd like to come in with some reflections, responses to Garima and Sejal's comments. And post that, we could possibly open up.
Stop sharing. Can somebody help me do that? I'm not able to see. I'm trying to stop sharing.
In the meanwhile, Anjani, would you like to come in with a few thoughts before we open up to questions from the delegates?
Just very brief thoughts. I think we can open up just in a very brief response. I just want to support, I think, what both Garima and Sejal are saying. Garima, the idea that we need mixed methods, I think, is of course fundamental. I think everybody accepts that we have to get a complete picture. And particularly when you do quantitative work, you're going to get a small little snapshot of the whole thing. That being said, I think what is happening slowly, a little bit too slowly for my liking, is this movement away from a focus just on impact evaluation with more of a focus on let's really understand something. So I don't think it's important whether the project works or not, because that rarely moves over to other environments. It is important to understand why that project works and investigate specifics. And there's also, I think, a second need in the empirical literature is to move away from pilots to working on scale. So, if you're going to make a difference in India, it's not going to come because you're working in 20 villages in some part of India. It has to come from a program and scale. And the way programs are, you can take a really successful pilot, but when you scale it, everything changes, literally everything. And so we don't even learn from those in terms of what goes on in scale. We use a lot of mixed methods in the work that I do. And I think the other part that should be emphasized, again, just talk about this way of research, there has to be more discussion amongst researchers. So it doesn't help if there's somebody out there doing mixed methods and a process review and I'm doing my quantitative work and none of us meet unless we meet at a forum. So the more integration we have between practitioners, policymakers, researchers from all sides, and forums like this are a great way to have it. I don't think Sejal was fair enough to the work that she's doing with Anandi. So that is my only criticism of her presentation. The work is truly amazing. I haven't unfortunately seen the work in Anandi, but I've seen the other three, Chaitanya, Pradhan, PRI, and I do also feel that this is the next step. I actually think it would have been the first step. So we started off with savings and loans and saying that was necessary to build the institution and to give women a sense of what it is, and then we'll move on to the other. And I think perhaps we should have done the reverse. Women are actually much more excited and involved if you start asking them about their lives and their children and their husbands, and what they've got out of these forums is truly amazing. And I feel that maybe we should have gone that way, because we now have this position where we're giving them loans. The loans are useful, not useful, not much going on there. But if we had started with telling women, okay, I'm going to give you an asset, but it's really, really important that you acquire all these skills to give you your head on that. And maybe putting them together would have gone further. There are, of course, implementation issues. I know from what you all are doing in Anandi and Everett too. The big problem, as far as I'm concerned, is in scaling up programs, is this human capital issue. Where do you get the trained people? Where do you put in the training? The training is incredibly intensive. So I go to a training session of the leaders, the gender point people at the Gram Panchayat level. These are really inspiring women, but then they have to go back and train 100, 200, 300 women, and we are relying on women to do that. And those are the real challenges. But it's actually been very inspiring to see the work that you've been doing in Anandi.
Thank you. And we've started getting some really great questions. So I'm just going to pick three and sort of also suggest who could start off by answering, but please do add if you would like to. So the first question is to Anjani. Should training on gender be a stronger component of NRLM for improving gender norms? Is the current component sufficient in what is needed to change norms? And are we expecting way too much from programs like NRLM? We understand that there is a substitution of time from labor and income generating activities to SHG meetings. So I think this is something maybe Anjani, you and Sejal could sort of comment on. A question that's come for Garima is around, is it time for rural India to get childcare services, or the social and gender norms hinder that? Can elderly women in SHGs take care of children of other members? And maybe a third question that we could take at this point is around the average age of SHG members mentioned was 38 years, which most of women empowerment and labor force participation are, while most of women empowerment and labor force participation are determined by early life experiences. Should NRLM be targeted towards early years of women? So maybe commenting on, what's the age at which women enter self-help groups? Should we be looking at different sorts of groups for younger women versus older women? So maybe we can do this round of questions, and once, if we have time, we could possibly take another round of questions.
Well, I'll start off with training and then hand it over to Sejal to add her input. For me, I think training is the most important aspect, but simultaneously, I feel also that we can't just say training is important, we must include training. From now on, there should just be a ban on programs and we say, oh, these are the things we should do. We should always have, can we do it and how can we do it and what are the constraints? And the constraints in implementing a training program are huge. This is again going back to scale, the scaling of programs. all our training, whether it's school teachers, health workers, etc., we rely on this cluster model. You take a master trainer, then the trainer will train the next batch, and then you train another batch. It's really surprising to me that we don't evaluate that training much. That evaluation has actually just started in the schooling sphere. It has not happened, for example, in what is going on in NRLM. Just a standard, if I ask, here are women in this training group, and I said, do we know what they knew before they came in? Yeah, we administered a questionnaire, here's a questionnaire. But I said, there are no names on the questionnaire, so how do you know which women knew what and which women didn't? And then when they exit, do you know if they learned anything? And actually, they don't know if they learned anything at all. So the same way we evaluate programs, we are not doing the same thing for our training. And we actually have no knowledge of whether that training is successful or not. It is critical. I really do think it's a critical component, but we don't pay any attention to that. The small training strategies, again, going back to these sessions I attended, what do you do if a woman comes, there were actually, say out of the group of 28 there were about 10 who would come with young children. There was actually no creche. So here we are at NRLM emphasizing roles of women's rights of, there was nothing. So if the children sat there throughout, and if a child cried, the woman would get up and leave for an hour or two and then come back. So again, this lack of emphasis on what exactly is, we pay attention to the content, but we really never even know if people are learning anything. And then we don't know what goes on. So one of the things I was excited about in this gender transformative program, there were 4 different approaches being implemented to training. One was, train at the block level and then it'll filter down. The other was train at the SAG level and then it'll go up. And there was a lot of room to experiment, to learn from that. And yet that was not part of, the evaluation going forward. And I think it should have been the central part of it. I'll answer the last thing on women's thing and then stop talking and hand it over to Sejal and to Garima. This focus on young women, I find, I was taken aback that the requirement in NRLM is that you should be a married woman. And that, of course, is because women, if you're not married, you're moving. And so it's always a married woman. But there are severe social restrictions on the severest social restrictions are on young brides. And so they don't join these groups, they do come later on. There's a different program, I think some of you may be familiar with it, but this is in Orissa, it's the Mission Shakti self-help groups. And the Mission Shakti self-help groups actually work with very young women, with Anganwadi workers and through the whole center. So it's a completely different approach. And again, for me, it would be really interesting to see how those 2 programs work. In fact, what has happened in Orissa, I may be not stating it very well because it's just observations, not from any research. But both those 2 programs have become politicized in different ways. And so instead of them combining effectively, they're actually just overburdening the system. And I think they're both adversely affecting each other. But those are things that I think are worth exploring.
Agree. I think the training methodology also needs to change. We're talking about, based on principles of andragogy. So there's a lot of peers learning and sharing that can happen. So for me, this, more trainings or more opportunities for women and looking at training methods which leverage on what women already know and then decide what they want to learn next. Handing over the control back to the institutions and the forums, whether it be the SHG, VO or CLF, they become, for me, and what is disturbing is that these have become still very program-led, top-down, and we need to find more methods of letting women take control of these forums, and I think that will show the way. So one is that. The other is really investments. I mean, I genuinely am shocked that, it's been 20 years since I have an ATM and I get all my accounts on my phone. I have internet access. But after so many years, we've not been able to crack that women are spending hours keeping accounts for the SHGs and all that. Don't we have a simple method, a digital method to enable them to take control over this and kind of break this hierarchy of the more literate or the prerats or program people actually controlling this? I think that is the other. And lastly, for creches, point very well taken. I just was in Valmi last week, Bhopal, a premier center, excellent, beautiful center where many of this NRLM trainings of MP take place. And they didn't have a creche. And I said, how can you do this? How can you not have a bathroom next to the convocation hall for women? And how can you not have a creche when there's so many women who are coming from MPSRLM to train? Excellent idea. Should we have older women? I mean, creches. Odisha has a large creche program, there's a lot of evidence around that, how creches actually improve outcomes for even malnutrition of children having a place. There have been large scale evaluations of that program. Look up Vandana Prasad's work, and Orissa is looking to upscale it. So that is very critical. Drinking water and creches are two infrastructure needs that can really free up women's time.
Yeah, I think Sejal has already answered about the childcare question also. Yes, I think that's a great idea of having senior women in SAGs, but it's also, we really need to think, is that a sustainable solution? And until we get to that point, it's not going to happen tomorrow or day after. So until we get to that point, we do need a lot more gender sensitization training. And this again ties to the first point about how the trainings need to be modified. What are the times that you're visiting homes, for example, even to mobilize women? What are the times that you're conducting group meetings? So as an example, during after the COVID-19 crisis, I think a survey in Orissa that was done by iWage, they found that women's responsibilities at home increased disproportionately, of course, compared to men, because of migrant husbands returning home, or just people being unemployed, people being at home all the time. So women were, as a result of that, they were not able to make it to their weekly or bi-weekly SAG meetings, and they're not going there, they are not pulling in money to save, they're not contributing to that. So it does have spillover effects also, right? So until we come to that point, how can we accommodate this in the implementation, in the day-to-day practices of the SAGs under the NRLM? And I think that can be done, and that should be included, that should be incorporated into the gender sensitization trainings.
Great, thank you to all three of you. Some really fabulous points around gender sensitive infrastructure and how programs such as NRLM also need to keep in mind needs and lives of women who they are engaging with, and hopefully are taking participatory approaches to also build up the program. I think maybe we could go towards 3 more questions and spend maybe 10 more minutes on that before we move to closing comments. So I'm just reading out from what the delegates are sending. How do we bring the behavioral change through the same channels along with financial assistance that we are providing so that women will start investing more in girls rather than their husbands or boys? Another question is, does change in women's empowerment also shift the change in male empowerment levels? Is there any direct or indirect relationship between women and men's empowerment? And lastly, maybe we could take, are there any cash flows from SAGs in the form of agri-credit? Can this be looked forward for increasing incomes, even if it means to include the male of the household? Maybe we start with the opposite order this time. Garima, would you like to go first? Your pick of question.
Yeah, can you just repeat the first question on behavioral change?
How do we bring the behavioral change through the same channels along with financial assistance so that we are providing women with the resources to start investing more in girls rather than husband or boys?
Sure. Yeah, so I think especially for a program like the NRLM, just thinking conceptually of how the program starts, what activities happen at first, and then what activities happen after 2 years or 3 years. Behavioral change comes down the line, right? It does not happen at the or currently, from what I understand, it does not happen at the first instance. First, there is a focus on financial inclusion, on just group meetings, these pooling together your savings and the intra-group lending. And That is followed by what Anjani showed today, the CIF disbursement and the larger loans that women can then avail. And I think somewhere along the chain, way we usually think about the conceptual framework, we say, okay, after they get the loans, then they invest in income generating opportunities. And then after that, that would lead to, over time, women's empowerment, political empowerment, social empowerment. We need to incorporate behavioral change, I think, right from the start through all of these stages. It cannot just be expected to come in the end. So when I think it should be included in financial inclusion trainings, which I do believe it does, but maybe Anjani can speak more to that. And the second question on women's empowerment leading to men's empowerment, I think there is I don't think the way the empowerment is measured for men currently really captures the whole household's sort of empowerment, right? So the focus on most of these impact evaluations are on measuring women's empowerment. Do we really look at beyond income and consumption? What are the other factors in the households that are changing? Is asset ownership shifting within households? Is decision-making shifting within households? These questions, I think, need to be looked at more.
I'll take the middle question first. Does women's empowerment change men's empowerment? Yes, gender equality outcomes are good for both. And especially when you're talking of ST/SC, it's not only intra-household. I find that there's much lesser resistance amongst poor men and households of ST or SC against women's mobility or engagement. If there's less fear that the women have of the police and they're able to engage or access services, negotiate there, it does also empower the community on the whole. If the SC women have more voice in the Gram Sabha, are able to leverage resources from the Gram Sabha into their areas, hamlets, then yes, the community gains as a whole, and there is shifts of power which are not only between men and women. We understand in India that these are between caste and between class and between people with different abilities. So I think in that sense, gender equality outcomes are good for that community which are more marginalized. There's a very clear, for me, it's very clear, and it's very clear from the men, and we don't get too much resistance there. What is the third question, Satya?
The question was on are there cash flows from SHGs in the form of agri credit, and can this be looked at, ways of increasing incomes, even if it means to include the male of the household?
Yeah, I think this PMGKSY is a very telling fact that if only there are 13% operational holdings with women, then obviously that 6,000 rupees has not gone to women farmers, who are the largest number of small and marginal farmers in the country. So certainly, if you people, I don't know, I'm much older, but in the Chidambaram time, when there was a waiver of the first agriculture loans, it was extended to the SHGs, because women have actually borrowed much more from SHGs for agriculture credit. So can there be a better convergence between agriculture investments, both in infrastructure, technology? Women are still getting these very, very small tools, drudgery reduction tools, but the big assets that can be collectively owned and utilized for better value chain, for reducing drudgery, for improving irrigation access. These certainly, I think there's tremendous potential to do that in the livestock, because very poor families have very few assets. So why are we fighting for intra-household assets? Let's look at the larger pool of assets, access to commons, access to larger resources, natural. This Kerala experiment of land lease by women farmers, equipping one set of women agriculture labor, have a lot of tools, and they are doing very well. So there are good examples, and like Anjani said, these are pilots, and really the challenge is how do we create the will to upscale.
Maybe I'll try and be a little bit shorter in my responses over here and just go through them in order. The first was on behavioral change, and this, of course, is a big field of economics. Everybody stretches it, and even when you do any evaluation, you always ask to put in a component on that. My perspective might be a little bit different, and I guess I do too much introspection when you think of all these things. But if you think of yourself and think of where you are and think of the things that are important to you, and then I ask you, where did all that come from? I think there are going to be very few people who said there was a training program I undertook, and that's really shaped all my norms and beliefs and where I am right now. So if you look at it in that perspective and you ask, where do the norms, that shape our lives, where do they come from? They do come from our families and the communities where we grew up. Schools play a large part, but the school is really a manifestation of your community because we all went to schools which are basically members of our community. And I think that is really what we have to come back to, these major institutions that shape people's lives, and never forget that that is really where things are going on. So I know that there were actually, again, going back to Jharkhand this time, what this is all going forward. So the person in charge of NRLM there was telling me all these tremendous things, and I kept saying, wow, this is fantastic. And then I would turn to him and say, is this really being done? And he said, no, TBD, to be done. But the wish list was tremendous, and some of them included things like SAG members were going to work with school children. School children are going to participate more in meetings. Members from other communities are going to. Those things I think are really critical. I think just building that community and shaping SAGs as part of this, and somehow widening what we think of as communities, include all that. That is probably one of the big ways in which behavioral change happens. I did want to talk very briefly about some of the SAGs in Maharashtra that I spent some time in, and this is in Palghar district. Palghar now is commuting distance from Bombay, and the change in Palghar is tremendous. It is truly tremendous. You see women who have one daughter and then no more children. And I'll say, where's your son and who's going to look after you in old age? And she said, my daughter is going to look after me. And in fact, the daughter was. The daughter was taking a loan, not for her husband or her son, but for her brother, and things like that. And how had this change happened? It had actually happened as a consequence of urbanization. All the sons had moved on to Bombay. So now the sons were as separate as from the parents as were the daughters. And then the bonds between the daughter and the mother actually were stronger than between the sons. Lots of other ways in which Palghar just stood out. The people who are working in self-help groups were living in Thana and commuting to work there. The teachers all came from there. And so again, you saw this huge transformation in the community, but it came really because you were linking what used to be villages to a much broader ecosystem. And if I had to think of, how are we going to get behavioral change, I think that is really the way that it's going to happen. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to switch up, go past the second one. I think the people have talked about it. And briefly, just the third one, do SAGs currently have anything forms of agri-credit? This is in the TBD list. I think going forward, the intent is to move them more towards like producer group operations and have much more in terms of livelihoods, and it is going to happen. Again, we do have to think a lot about the implementation and how exactly it is going to happen. So we do have experiences of women's producer groups. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Vardha program in Purnia district in Bihar, where there were producer groups of women who were completely in charge of the marketing of maize, which is the major cash crop over there. But of the family's cash crop, I would say about 20% or so, or less even, came to women to market through that. And if you think that men were just going to give up their control of income, hand it over to women, the money would then have to go into the woman's bank account, and the man would have to ask her, can you give me 100 rupees so I can go and have tea? It's not going to happen. And unless we sort of build in something which is practical, that program itself may not go far. So implementation, again, I think is critical.
Thank you all. And if I could just sort of add maybe two points over here. One around the importance of a participatory approach and the process of collectivization. That is really what possibly leads to empowerment and to behavior change. Because as Anjani said, no one's thinking about a training program really shifting the way you think and behave and norms, but really that process of learning together, possibly learning by doing and learning from and peer support and peer networks, which really pushes how norms get formed, is possibly what is really powerful. And if one could sort of think about strengthening those aspects of NRLM and other such programs, it could really be quite game changing. The second comment I wanted to add over here is about empowerment and thinking a little bit more holistically about empowerment. It's not really only about credit. It's not only about putting money in the hands of women, because as we've heard, it's very small amounts of money. And where does that money actually really go? Who has control? Who has decision-making power? So what's the link that one can actually build between an NRLM kind of program and other departments and programs that other departments would be running? So really bringing in a word which is used very much, very often, convergence. But I think Sejal also spoke about the work that Anandi is doing, and looking at things such as gender resource centers, looking at building those links between childcare and NRLM, so women's groups and the provision of childcare, possibly even health and nutrition services. I know that ECWG's work has also focused a lot on this, looking at what are those pathways to empowerment. And we do need possibly a lot more research, but as someone said earlier, it is about bringing together the research community, the practitioner community, policymakers, women themselves, and that sort of coming together of all these stakeholders, which will really help us in sort of pushing the agenda forward. With that, I will just share the one last question, which maybe you could sort of take into, keep in mind as you share closing comments. There was a question about what would be some simple initiatives you believe should be included within the program to make them more effective in their efforts towards empowerment. So if maybe you could sort of just weave that in as you share closing comments. We have about 7 minutes to go, so maybe 3 minutes each. Sejal, maybe I could ask you to start this time.
Okay, for me, the most simplest and effective things that can be done in the current program infrastructure is also to let women take control of the forums that they've organized. Whether it be the SHG or the VO or the CLF, do not lead only agendas from the top. There is an imagination that women should be discussing social issues, should be discussing issues of gender-based violence, and to act on it together. So I think just too much activity and control over top and leading what you think women need is, we should probably hold back on that and let women set the agendas on their own forums and act on it. Support where you can. That's it from me.
Garima, maybe you could go next.
Sure, yeah. I think related to that, to me, what would probably be most important is to really focus on how we are building these platforms as community institutions where women are really participating with voice. And like Sejal already said, instead of a top-down approach, how can we just make it a more participatory approach for all women? In terms of just going back to the evaluation component and just to try to understand what really works, I would again emphasize the point on studying really the differences in implementation, especially when we are talking about implementing something at scale. At a scale like the NRLM, with so much diversity across states, even within state, to really try to identify which parts, which components are working and what lessons can we borrow from across states or from within states, but across implementation contexts.
So just in conclusion, I'm glad I'm not a policymaker, because I really think the importance of our policies is, it just seems overwhelming to me that policies can make a huge, huge impact. And the impact can be positive and the impact can be negative. And very often we don't even know when the impact is negative or in which dimension it has been. That's such a huge responsibility and such a challenge. But I think also as researchers, then our focus also has to be on understanding a program in its entirety and understanding, I think, the program on scale and understanding all aspects of it. So just thinking in what Sejal just said, India is so diverse that the needs from one part of the country are going to be so completely different from another part. And even in the same block, the needs from one village are going to be completely different from the needs of one village. And the solution, I think, is has to be a mix. It can't just be that, okay, we're going to let women just sort it out for themselves. And it can't be that, okay, we're going to tell you exactly how to do it. One example from Bihar that just stands out in my mind, this is with regard to IGMSY, the maternal security program. And again, I was talking to women and noticed that the money would come into the account. They would just keep the money there, and then they would just take the whole money out without sort of saving any part of it. And I said, you're getting this big check for 2,000 rupees. Why don't you keep 100 there and take out something or the other? And the woman looked, the whole group of them sort of looked at you in amazement and said, you mean we can do that? We don't have to take out the whole 2,000 at a time? And I said, no, you don't have to. So on the one hand, I fully agree that we can't be coming in there and acting like we know everything. But on the other hand, I think you have to recognize that, yes, there is a capability problem and that has to be built up. And so we need that kind of heterogeneity. Very often our programs itself cause a lot of, I think, the inequality in our country. And those are the things that I think we always have to be aware of and conscious of.
Thank you to all three of you, and I would not dare try to sum up this conversation. For the delegates, if you're interested in reading 3IE's multi-state evaluation of the NRLP, it is available at the Share Fair at the 3IE booth, so please do reach out over there. They also have a video on the impact of on households and some issue briefs which present the main findings. The thematic papers that Dr. Kocher mentioned in her presentation today will be available soon, in a couple of months. With that, I'd really like to thank the three panelists. This has been a fabulous conversation, so much depth, and I, just personally speaking, I think what is most impactful is when one is able to weave together hard data with the stories that go along with it, and I hope that that's something that we are able to continue doing. With that, I'll hand over back to Pooja.
I thank the speakers for this very insightful discussion covering various aspects of women's empowerment in rural areas, the principles and pathways to women's empowerment, progress and reverse progress made, and the learnings as emerging from evidence. Thank you, Sachi, for your excellent moderation and time management that helped bring out the best from the speakers. With this, we conclude our session and we'll reconvene after a short break for the next session titled Social Stock Exchange, a Way Forward for NGOs. Thank you all.